Hello, everyone. We're going to begin. Hello, my name is Felix, and we welcome our new and returning attendees. Today, we'll be conducting our webinar series focusing on Bitcoin regulation. This is part 4 and the last part of our webinar regulatory series hosted by Payment Week. Throughout this month, we discussed the growing attention that digital currencies have received from regulators in the various businesses and industries that Bitcoin has reached over these last few years. We've had the leading players in the Bitcoin industry give their take on defining Bitcoin, which we discussed in the first and second webinar, growing investment interest in digital currencies from Wall Street, which was also discussed in the second webinar, and understanding the regulatory hurdles that these endeavors entail. Last week, for instance, we had 2 CEOs of the leading Bitcoin ATM manufacturers in the space, Rebelcoin's Jordan Kelly, Lamassu Zuck Harvey, and Bitcoin's Foundation Chairman of the Regulatory Affairs Committee, Marcus Santori, spoke. We discussed how these companies manage their compliance and how these businesses can be the main touch point for consumers to receive and manage their Bitcoin. We'll now focus our attention on the global of Bitcoin regulation and the future of digital currencies around the world. Today, we'll compare the regulatory outlook on Bitcoin, domestic and abroad, and we'll discuss the future of digital currencies as a tool for remittance, consumer merchant adoption, and also the idea that Bitcoin can become a standard universal currency worldwide, if it hasn't already. The US is certainly one of the countries leading the change in regulating cryptocurrencies. And as we discussed in our previous webinars, states such as New York have proposed their own regulations, specifically proposed BitLicense by New York Division of Financial Services. We'll wait to see what the final regulations will look like, hopefully later this year or early in 2015. Other markets such as Canada, France, and the UK have also taken a stand on Bitcoin to some degree. Regulatory policies in other countries are a bit uncertain or murky. And we're specifically talking about countries like China or Russia, where the regulatory environment is still unclear. And that's what we're going to discuss later today. For Bitcoin to survive, the regulatory policies internationally must be crafted that are uniquely tailored to the open-sourced P2P nature of this new asset class. Let's explore the viability of digital currencies today as basis for not just business, but a catalyst for change. And disruption in investment and banking that many proponents believe is necessary. Today, I'd like to welcome our distinguished speakers from 2 of the leading Bitcoin businesses and their respective global markets that are currently tackling these issues, and are looked upon as the explorers of the new frontier. First with us, we have Dan Romero, who's the Manager of Business Development at Coinbase, a leading US-based exchange and merchant solution for Bitcoin acceptance. Dan previously worked at Envoy on product and business development and also at Bain & Company. With us today, we're also privileged to have Bobby Lee, who serves as CEO of BTC China, the first Bitcoin exchange in China. He's held numerous positions at Yahoo, EMC, Best TV, and also previously served as VP of Technology for Walmart's China e-commerce business. These gentlemen are well positioned to speak on the global position of Bitcoin in the global market space. So before I proceed with the questions to the panels, I would like to first advise the audience that we'll be happy to take your questions at the end of the presentation by these panelists. Please direct them to the main forum, and we will select a few closer towards the end of this webinar. So let's begin. Let me ask this question to both panelists today. Is Bitcoin really the first global currency or medium of exchange? And if it is, what do you feel the current global regulatory environment is like? I'm asking a very high level question as we discussed the US regulatory environment in the last three webinars. Perhaps you could give us a perspective on the global regulatory outlook today. Thank you.
Who should go first?
Dan or Bobby, please feel free to jump in. Bobby, would you
Felix,
like?
hi, this is Bobby. Yeah, I'm happy to go first. Can you? I hope you guys can hear me clearly. Are you asking just about
Yeah,
overall?
yeah.
Yeah.
If you could,
So, well,
go ahead.
no, go ahead, please. Please be more specific.
If you could perhaps comment on what, from a very high level, what is the current global view, global regulatory view on Bitcoin? In the last few webinars, we discussed the regulatory environment in the US. Specifically, we discussed Bitcoin being used as an asset class for on Wall Street and potentially not coming to the houses of Main Street. Perhaps you could give us an overview, you and Dan could give us, what is the current global regulatory environment for Bitcoin or other cryptocurrencies?
Yeah, this is Bobby Lee. I'm happy to share my opinion and thoughts on this. However, I don't, even though I consider myself a citizen of the world, I am actually not, I don't speak for the world. I don't speak for the world government, so to speak. Bitcoin definitely has the potential to be the first global currency, uh, in the way that the US dollar has been the global reserve currency. However, frankly speaking, today, even though Bitcoin has the potential, it really hasn't reach nearly the ubiquity of the US dollar around the world, not just for online, but even offline usage. What in terms of regulation, a few comments is my perception, from traveling around the world and speaking to different entities and government organizations, is that the so-called the governments and the countries are still sort of waiting or playing a waiting game to see how if Bitcoin takes off and then reacting to it by setting up more regulation or rule around it. So it's still being a laggard, if you will. It's still sort of wait and see approach. That's unfortunate, which is why the Bitcoin proponents are always, moving forward and encouraging governments to looking into this, everything from taxation to banking rules, how to deal with Bitcoin in the economy, and so on.
Hi, this is Dan Romero from Coinbase, and I think Bobby makes a couple great points there. And one thing I'd like to say about the global currency or medium of exchange is that you have plenty of things throughout history that have functioned similarly in that gold. Today, you can argue the US dollar. Obviously, there are a lot of commodities that, to a certain degree, can be valued anywhere in the world because of universal usage. But what excites me most about Bitcoin, and frankly, what I think is most interesting, is that it's the first global open network that has the properties of both currency and can function as a medium of exchange. Whereas I think a lot of the previous and current mediums of exchange and currencies are controlled a little bit more by centralized entities or are kind of markets that are tough to get into. It's not like you can just go buy a gold mine as an average consumer, but you can buy some Bitcoin and you can participate in this big global open network. As regards to the regulatory environment, I think what we've seen is an increasing amount of guidance from governments and regulatory bodies, but from actual regulatory and legislative perspective, we don't have a lot of rules on the books specifically addressing Bitcoin. I think New York is probably the first, and you've seen some, like I said before, some pretty hefty guidance that started to come out of Europe, here in the US. But I think over the next 12, 18 months, you're going to see a lot of uh, different jurisdictions start to put their first real regulation and legislation around Bitcoin.
Let me follow up on this.
And
Do you
I want to add
gentlemen
a few more
feel?
about.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Bobby.
Yeah, this is Bobby again. To just add a little bit more color, one of the challenges over the last few years, Bitcoin's been around for close to 6 years now. One of the reasons why regulation hasn't happened naturally is because Bitcoin has proven itself to be so different than any other asset class or any sort of other monetary or investment asset class. Where in every country, different asset classes, everything from real estate to precious metals, commodities, to stocks, equities, bonds, currencies, have always fall under different regulatory departments or regulatory agencies. And Bitcoin going to be so different because of its, because of its unique features and being so powerful. We all know it's proven to be so different than that it naturally doesn't fit into any existing category. And when that happens, naturally, no one, it's not anyone who should stand up and say, "Oh, this is my domain, and therefore it should be regulated this way." So that's one of the natural challenges Bitcoin faces for being so different and revolutionary. Go ahead,
Do you think that
Felix.
Bitcoin was meant to be regulated? Just to follow up on that.
I, yeah, Satoshi, I don't think. Well, let me say different. I think the early supporters of Bitcoin definitely did not want Bitcoin to be regulated. That may or may not have been Satoshi's intent, in terms of it being truly decentralized. So there's that spirit that it is truly decentralized and not controlled by any government. But on the flip side is if it's truly to be successful and embraced in society and in humanity, then it has to deal with people and governments and commerce and companies, which means that there has to be some rules, basic rules, and so on, right? Like if you just take an extreme example like automobiles, right? For automobiles to be successful, you have to have roads and highways and traffic rules, and people to be licensed to drive cars. I know this is a far-fetched goal, but for Bitcoin to be successful, then you want it to be integrated in society, right? So if you truly want Bitcoin to not be regulated, then you have to accept you have to accept the reality where we don't regulate Bitcoin, or vice versa. If you want a worldview where Bitcoin is never to be regulated, then you have to accept a situation where Bitcoin is of limited penetration in society. You can't have it both ways.
I think the question of whether it's meant to be regulated is not as important as whether it's going to be. So I think most innovations, when the inventor or the initial group starts to use that innovation, whether that's the automobile or the internet or email or even pharmaceuticals to a certain degree, your original creators aren't thinking about the regulatory implications right away as much as the over time, the regulatory response is naturally dictated based on usage, how important things will be, what are potential risks for consumers and businesses, and regulation is just a reality, and it's almost a validation to a certain degree that it's legitimate. Regulators don't pay attention to things that aren't important. So regulatory oversight is almost to a degree is kind of a validation that Bitcoin is here to stay. Bitcoin is important. Um, Whether or not that regulation is prohibitive to further spreading and kind of adoption of Bitcoin, that's to be determined. But I think what's interesting about
Yeah,
Bitcoin,
yeah.
going
Dan
back to
makes
my
a
original,
great point about the fact that. Go ahead, Dan.
oh, I was just going to say, going back to my original point, Bitcoin's a global open network. There are going to be a lot of different takes on Bitcoin, at least at first. And certain countries are probably going to be more progressive and balanced in their regulation. Others are going to be a little bit harsher. And I think you'll see Bitcoin take off in the countries where there's a more progressive stance towards regulation. And I think other countries will have to reevaluate maybe their original policies were a little too harsh or didn't see the full potential of Bitcoin.
Do you gentlemen
Yeah, I
feel
want
that?
to make a
Go
comment on.
ahead, Bobby.
Oh, just sorry to keep dragging this out. Just another quick comment. Uh, even though, the New York DFS, this is the first time there's been actually proposed, written down regulations for Bitcoin. Uh, so even though none of the other countries or states have actually put out strong regulation of Bitcoin, but the mere fact that all the countries are now looking into this, right? There's a lot of evidence that different countries are looking into it, and there's rumblings and so on. That's a great evidence of great indication of the success and the ultimate uh, innovation and power of Bitcoin. So I think that's a good step. It's a good sign of good things to come.
Do you gentlemen feel we're going to see? I know we talked about the internal controls or internal regulatory um, um, oversight by U.S. for instance. Are we likely to see different countries collaborate in jointly overseeing the cryptocurrency environment? And just to sort of draw a little bit of comparison, in following the 2008 financial crisis, we've seen governments collaborate to avoid any further meltdown um, as a result of mortgage-backed securities, various exotic derivative products. Um, not being really overseen, not only independently but also jointly, as we live in a very global environment. Um, do you think we're going to see, for instance, U.S. and China sign a treaty, or U.S. and EU, or other jurisdictions where they're going to jointly collaborate to regulate Bitcoin or other cryptocurrencies?
I'm not sure what
Felix,
situation
could
that
you
would
suggest?
entail.
Bobby, you had a question?
Go ahead, Dan. No, I was just going to ask Felix to recommend who goes first. Otherwise, we keep stepping on each other. So Dan, go ahead first.
Sure.
Sure. I think if you think about what regulation for Bitcoin means, I think it's a big open network. I'm going to keep saying this because, frankly, that's I think the most interesting thing about Bitcoin. And by that definition, I think it's very hard to centrally regulate Bitcoin. I think what you'll see is that regulation is going to naturally start to happen around the edges, and specifically around the on ramps and off ramps into Bitcoin, where it touches current fiat currency or the existing financial infrastructure, as you mentioned, Felix. That's the natural place for regulation to happen because those entities are already regulated, and the governments and regulatory bodies have a pretty good understanding of how to regulate fiat currency and the existing financial infrastructure. That would be like saying, oh, well, the U.S. government's now going to regulate, um, email or BitTorrent or any other protocol level parts of the internet. Yeah, they do have some control in certain endpoints, but at the end of the day, if you try to regulate spam in the U.S., people move to Russia. And ultimately, we still use email every day because it's a very productive tool and has massive economic benefits for business. But there are some downsides to using email because it's an open network. I actually think Bitcoin potentially could even help solve some of the problems with email because of its natural properties. But I think that's the important thing to think about is that what can regulators actually regulate, and what makes the most sense is the edge cases where people are moving in and out of the network because it already touches regulated institutions.
Yeah, I agree with what Dan has said.
Okay. Um, Bobby, my next question is directed to you. Um, Perhaps, since you're based in mainland China, if I'm not mistaken, at Shanghai specifically, perhaps you could tell us more about what the current regulatory environment is in mainland China um, for Bitcoin. Are you seeing more merchants accepting Bitcoin? Um, Perhaps you could give us a picture of what the environment is like today in mainland China.
Yeah, since the PBOC, the People's Bank of China, Central Bank of China, started officially regulating Bitcoin in early December of last year, it's really a stopgap measure. Now that we've had time to look at the past of what's happened, I really would characterize it as a stopgap measure. The reason is that essentially the Chinese government saw the massive activity in the trading and buying and selling, the frenzy of people investing and speculating in Bitcoin, and they thought that could lead to a dangerous end, such as a bubble popping. So they've said, we should, slow it down, make sure there's some good, ground rules about it, and that's why the PBOC put out this regulation in early December of last year. The reason I call it stopgap is because it really isn't complete, nor it isn't complete because the government probably wasn't in the position to really lead in this space, even though they may have been the first to sort of put this in place, but it was the wording and the things in there were more of a skeletal structure, and they were really leaning on sort of to wait and see how the rest of the world will regulate Bitcoin, and then to add more meat to the skeleton. And especially, they were probably looking towards what the U.S. will do, because historically the U.S. has always played a leading role in regulating financial financial companies, institutions, investment assets, and so on and so forth. So I think many countries besides China are also looking to the U.S. And probably in this case, if New York takes the lead, the DFS might come out and win some points for doing that. Uh, on the local side in China, having had the PBOC come in with these regulatory rules, it's really calmed down the market in early this year, and a lot of people are taking a time out, taking a sort of a break. A lot of the would-be buyers and speculators are on the sidelines, but but frankly speaking, since early this summer, we've seen a pickup in customers, in people who are interested again, and the reason there is because we're thinking that some time has passed, and the people who sat on the sidelines, many were thinking that Bitcoin would die and would be squashed and the price would go to zero, because many don't fully understand the decentralized nature of Bitcoin, that one country government cannot truly ban it or extinguish it. So now that some time has passed, Bitcoin is still alive and well. The interest level is picking back up. It's like, oh my gosh, this has legs. So we're seeing a renewed interest, not just in trading, but also in merchant acceptance. Now, obviously, the large companies and organizations in China are still uh, technically, afraid of or wary about fully publicly accepting Bitcoin. But the smaller merchants are very intrigued by the notion of accepting Bitcoin, because there's really no downside to accepting Bitcoin. So that's sort of my take on that in China.
Bobby, just a few minutes ago, you mentioned that correct me if I'm wrong, there's sort of this see approach, what the U.S. is going to do, and particularly the state of New York. Are we likely to see, if the state of New York or other states to follow in regulating um, the purchase and sale of Bitcoin, um, are we likely to see a similar license in China being required, or do you think that that's still pretty early to tell?
Well, well, in China, the central bank has already issued preliminary paperwork, talking about Bitcoin, how it's classified, what's allowed, what's not allowed, and so on. It, I personally think that once the U.S. has real formal rules about Bitcoin, it's very much the case that China and many other countries will start adopting some of these similar stances for Bitcoin in their own countries, including China. Now, so the answer is yes. I think that will happen. Um, what's good about the Chinese way of doing things? They issue the paperwork And in some sense, when they want to sort of adjust it, they don't have to reissue the paperwork. They don't have to do a revision two or anything. All they do is they just change the verbal guidance to sort of move the lines a little bit without moving the the actual wording. So I think it's going to be a fluid process, and we will see more, more real regulation with more meat in the coming months and years, especially after the U.S. does it for real.
Okay, thank you. And one more question to you, Bobby. Uh, can you tell us if you're familiar with what is the current state and how different is the current state of the regulatory environment is in Hong Kong and Taiwan? Do you find that those two territories are much more accepting Bitcoin? Is it much more easier for someone to establish operations in cryptocurrency in those two territories, or are the rules pretty much the same as they are in mainland China?
To be honest, I think China actually has pretty relaxed rules about Bitcoin companies, because it's treated as a digital asset. There are no hard rules about Bitcoin companies in China. There's some recommendations about KYC, best practices, but none of those have been clearly specified. To be honest, it hasn't been fleshed out yet. It's been sort of vaguely saying, oh, Bitcoin exchanges need to do this and this and that, but none of that has been fleshed out. So it's pretty relaxed in China. In Taiwan and Hong Kong, if you look at Greater China, we're then talking about Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Macau. It turns out Greater China is actually more strict. What I found is that in Hong Kong and also Taiwan is that the the banking situation is still very tough, just like in China. But the difference is that in China, there's a lot of leeway in terms of the usage of personal bank accounts in order to run these types of business operations. Whereas in Taiwan and in Hong Kong, the more formal, the more sort of mature business ecosystem actually doesn't allow for much latitude out there using a corporate bank account for holding funds. So in Taiwan, it's very strict, right? Bitcoin companies or companies in general are not allowed to hold customer funds. So only banks are allowed to do that. So therefore, it's a much higher burden. Uh, yeah, and that's probably true everywhere else in the world. The government appears to say one thing, but the rules are still very strict in terms of where Bitcoin touches fiat currencies.
Thank you, Bobby. My next question is for Dan. Um, Dan, let's talk a little bit about Coinbase, and perhaps you could tell us a little bit about how you guys are keeping track of the evolving regulatory landscape. And what are some of the challenges, and how are you dealing with the regulatory challenges um, in this world?
Yeah, so we're paying close attention to country-specific developments all over the world, whether that's keeping track of the news on a daily basis, and feels like on a daily basis there's new news related to this, but also just trying to engage partners, both on a regulatory front, but also from a banking partner point of view. And the common theme that's emerged, and Bobby alluded to it earlier, was that no one kind of wants to be first here, and everyone wants to play the wait and see approach, specifically from the banking side of things. Because if you think about it, you need in any given country, you need the ability to move, as we mentioned before, from fiat to Bitcoin and Bitcoin to fiat for it to have a well functioning market at this point. And the main question that we often hear is, can I actually be working with a Bitcoin company in my jurisdiction? Because in most cases, Bitcoin's still unregulated. And while guidance is somewhat useful from hey, the government's paying attention to Bitcoin, it's not necessarily useful from what's my potential risk here? What could I potentially be liable for in a bad scenario? I think the arguments for the benefits of Bitcoin seem pretty compelling, but it's the kind of unknown around Bitcoin and specifically around the regulatory front that I think continues to be a challenge. So one thing, again, it's not regulation everywhere, but smart regulation and kind of clear, here's how to work with a Bitcoin company can actually really help improve Bitcoin's stance from that conversion of fiat to Bitcoin and playing nicely with the existing financial infrastructure. And in those cases, I think that will actually really help Bitcoin's adoption globally because now people are going to be able to easily move into Bitcoin and then be able to stay within Bitcoin and use it for the benefits that Bitcoin provides.
Yeah, and my next question, is actually U.S. based, a domestic question, since you're based in the U.S. It's the same question I asked participants, panelists, during the last 3 webinars. I want to ask you the same question. Do you think the industry, at least in the U.S., would benefit if it had its own self-regulatory organization? Is this something that you would find useful for stability, credibility, and regulation of cryptocurrency, specifically Bitcoin? Or is this perhaps something that you don't think would be such a wise idea and the industry regulate itself? What are your thoughts?
I want to be clear on the question. Is it a body that's representing Bitcoin's interests, or are you talking more about a specific, the IRS equivalent of cryptocurrency?
The maybe not the IRS, but for instance, as in equities industries, you have FINRA, right? A self-regulatory organization which is comprised of membership. It
Okay.
regulates itself. It has its own rules. It's ultimately overseen by a federal regulator, but it's not. It's more of an administrative arm of federal regulator, which has membership.
I think that's an interesting idea. The real crux of the issue comes down to how is Bitcoin going to be regulated, and who is the regulatory body that would oversee that institution? I think is the more important question right now. And once we kind of have a good sense for that, is it the OCC? Is it state level? Is it FinCEN? Is it IRS? You can see that there's a lot of different organizations that kind of have opinions on Bitcoin. And I think over the next, again, 12 to 18 months, that's going to sort itself out. There's probably going to be not only regulation, but potentially legislation in some places in the US. And I think at that point, there will be probably a pretty clear environment. This is how you can operate as a Bitcoin company in the US and do everything under kind of good regulatory practice. And then at that point, I think that probably might be an interesting idea.
Okay. My next question is to both of you gentlemen, and maybe Bobby could take the lead initially. This one is specific to the jurisdictions that ban or prohibit Bitcoin. Some of the jurisdictions that you probably know where Bitcoin is illegal: Bolivia, Ecuador, Iceland, and a few others. Though not that many jurisdictions have taken the stance to completely prohibit cryptocurrencies from being traded or used or exchanged in their countries. Do you think we're going to see more countries ban or prohibit cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin? Or do you think that the trend is going to be very different? That you know we're likely to see more countries welcome this product.
I think you'll see a
Bobby?
mix. Go ahead, Bobby.
Okay. In terms of banning Bitcoin, I think, yeah, certainly today there are some countries who have come out and said they're going to ban Bitcoin. I think banning Bitcoin is only effective for businesses. What I'm trying to say is that governments actually have a good grasp over businesses. They have a good control of what businesses and companies are allowed to do versus what they're not allowed to do, because they can always give away the business license and or issue punishment and fees and fines to businesses. So businesses are well controlled by governments in terms of what they can and cannot do, such as touch Bitcoin, send, receive, store, buy, sell, trade Bitcoins. Okay, so that I agree with. However, for individuals, I think, truthfully speaking, I think governments will have a tough time to ban individuals from from using Bitcoin. If you boil down to it, Bitcoin is just information, right? For me to have some Bitcoin is just for me to have information, specifically the knowledge of the private key. So there's always plausible deniability. There's always way for people to deny the fact that they have Bitcoins. And for people to use Bitcoins, it's just sending information back and forth. It's just communication. It's just sending a message onto the Bitcoin, P2P network, moving Bitcoins around. So in the end, information and communication, it's hard for governments to ban on a private individual basis. So I think that's futile for governments who try to do that. Certainly so today, governments who try to do that, it's mostly because they don't understand what Bitcoin is, which is why they think they can just outlaw it and forbid its citizens to use, store, send, receive Bitcoins. But that's in my mind, that's futile. Down the road, I think it's more likely the governments will try to, they can try to limit and or corner Bitcoin by imposing regulation. So the real question is, what's going to happen? Will regulation be more friendly, or will it be very harsh and strict? That's the ultimate test of time. Thanks.
I think a good analogy here would be email, and how even in the late 70s and early 1980s, the US was considering giving the Postal Service, which has a legal monopoly on regular mail, and I know that's somewhat changed today with UPS and FedEx, but at the time, the post office had a legal monopoly on mail. The US government was legitimately thinking about giving the Postal Service a legal monopoly on electronic mail. If you look at some of the articles that were written, the New York Times has a bunch of them. They were talking about how, well, now if the Postal Service can offer email services, we can now get messages sent anywhere in the country within 2 days. And if you think about that today, it seems absolutely ridiculous that people would have thought that that was a good idea because the previous paradigm, the Post Service had a monopoly on transmission of communication. We should, in this new digital paradigm, hand that over to the existing service. And I think in some ways, I think that's what Bitcoin responses in some of these countries are. Well, we've had a legal monopoly on controlling money supply, how money moves, the banking system, everything associated with that. And now that you have this new open network that allows individuals to peer-to-peer send value, your natural reaction, and Bobby well stated it, is that there's not an understanding. So the first thing you do if something you don't understand in some countries is just outright ban it or say it's illegal. I think over time, going back to my other point before, you'll see regulation naturally settle. And what Bobby said is totally true, is that businesses are something that governments are really good at controlling and regulating. Individuals, depending on the country and the government, it tends to be a little harder. And specifically, if you understand the nature of Bitcoin, it is information, it is communication. That's a lot harder to regulate. And in a lot of cases, in a lot of modern countries, there's a protection for freedom of speech. So I think that will play out again over the next couple years. But the jurisdictions that are banning Bitcoin today, 5 years from now, I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of them have re-engaged with Bitcoin, maybe with a smarter set of regulation that they're kind of copying from kind of more progressive countries that figured it out for the first time around.
So Dan, I think we've lost our moderator.
Okay. Well, I know one of the questions
I
that
can keep talking.
we were going to talk about was, and I'm happy to have you answer, Bobby. I'm also happy to talk about it, was international remittance. It's something
Yes,
I've
go ahead.
spent a good amount of time talking or thinking about here. So when we think about remittance, and I'm going to sound like a broken record, but one of my most convincing points about Bitcoin is it's a big open network, right? And if you think about remittance today, it's actually a series of closed and proprietary networks that span across multiple countries. You have the big remittance players that have hundreds of thousands of locations all around the world, so that I can walk into a physical location here in San Francisco, give them $100, and then within a pretty short period of time, for a fairly high fee, I can have that money remitted to anywhere in the world. I think what's interesting about Bitcoin is the early identified opportunity here is, well, we can replace this series of closed proprietary networks with this big open network that allows anyone to participate. And I think it goes back to a couple of the other points we've been talking. It's just a matter of time as a company like Coinbase builds out the infrastructure here in the U.S. Companies potentially building out that infrastructure in a place like the Philippines or Mexico or India, where these big remittance corridors. And once you kind of have two companies, or maybe it's one company, but ultimately you have two entities that are on either side of those borders that know how to operate within the regulatory frameworks of those countries, I actually think then you'll start to see a lot of remittance traffic just really start happening with Bitcoin. But I think a lot of what you're finding now is it's pretty difficult to buy Bitcoin in a lot of places around the world. So I still think that there's a lot of work to be done in the next year or two around infrastructure and really laying those rails for moving between local fiat currency into Bitcoin and doing that easily and in a way that the average consumer can understand. I think that's going to be a pretty big driver of this ultimate remittance use case.
I agree with you. I think remittance has always been a very large market, and with Bitcoin, that can only continue to grow the market as it offers a lower cost, faster solution. The challenge there is it's all about the on ramps and off ramps. If you look at the existing remittance companies, whether it's Western Union and so on, what they're strong at is having really good deep penetration of on ramps and off ramps. So it's not about moving the money; it's about having the on ramps and off ramps. In fact, many remittance companies don't actually do money; they just do accounting magic where they subtract and add numbers at different locations. But it's having that deep network of the people to deliver the money and to send and receive the money. So I think in that regard, Bitcoin still has a ways to go because we still don't have healthy on ramps and off ramps exchanges, if you will, all around the world in each country. So is our moderator back?
Gentlemen, I apologize. I had technical issues. Yeah, can you hear me? I apologize. I had some technical difficulties that kicked me offline. Since you touched the subject of exchanges, I know that, for instance, BTC China is an exchange that's based in Shanghai. We're likely to see global exchanges of Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies.
Well, we are seeing, right? I mean, there's, I think, now that Mt. Gox has gone away, I think Bitstamp has emerged as a de facto global exchange. They take a lot of international customers, and I think we'll see more of that. But the challenge in the end is an off ramps from my viewpoint. Each company, whether it's Bitstamp or any other exchange, has to in the end has to be domiciled because the company has to be domiciled with the government, with a country, with a location, in order to follow that set of rules, and they may even have to follow other countries' rules, such as New York DFS, BitLicense, stuff like that. But in the end, you can't have a global exchange that offers to have on ramps and off ramps in every single country unless they actually connect with every single country's banking infrastructure. So I think you will see more and more exchanges that offer services in more and more countries, but you'll never actually offer services in every single country. It's much like the banking situation today. You have global banks, they only call themselves global by name, but in reality, they don't serve every single country in the world. So that's my thought.
I think one thing that's interesting here compared to traditional exchange infrastructure for something like FX or even equities is that by nature, Bitcoin's global. Bitcoin, if I have it in the US or I have it in Europe, it's the same Bitcoin. it moves under the same protocol. So whereas in Europe you move money via SEPA, you move money in the US via ACH, there's this international wire and correspondent banking system. But ultimately, Bitcoin moves easily between kind of markets and exchanges. And the other thing to think about is a lot of these Bitcoin exchanges, at least today, when they start with an open API. So if you go sign up with Bitstamp or BTC China or any of these major Bitcoin exchanges today, you can actually be trading on all of them at the same time via APIs. And it certainly exists with the financial infrastructure today, but there's almost an element here of it was almost API driven first and open first, whereas I really can't go as an individual very easily get plugged in directly to NASDAQ. I have to use an intermediary, which makes it pretty interesting to see how this exchange environment around the world, and as Bobby said, the individual countries on and off ramps is going to play out. I think it's going to be a different story than we've seen before with other exchanges.
My last question for this webinar for both panelists today. You both gentlemen are leaders of two tier one companies in the space, two leading companies in the space. What's your view on Bitcoin's future? Is it optimistic? Is it cautiously, or is it something that you have concern about?
Who should go first?
I'm happy to go first.
Bobby, go ahead.
Dan, why don't you go first since you volunteered? Dan.
Okay. Saw an interesting chart yesterday from Benedict Evans. He works in Andreessen Horowitz on Twitter, where he was graphing Bitcoin job postings. I think it was on Indeed.com over the last couple of years, and it's, as you can guess, an up and to the right chart. If you've seen the most recent charts for the network hash rate for Bitcoin, it's on a very fast-growing exponential curve. These are, to me, the leading indicators of optimism and where Bitcoin is headed. I know a lot of people like to deride it as a bubble. They like to focus on the price. They focus on the negative news that might be associated with some of the earlier events in Bitcoin. But at the end of the day, when people are choosing to invest real dollars into R&D for mining equipment, and when people are investing their time to be working on Bitcoin as their full-time job, and that's only growing, that's a really optimistic sign for me. And those people who are starting to work on Bitcoin full-time today, 2 years or 3 years from now, are going to be working on that next generation or the future big platforms in Bitcoin, in addition to the people who are already working there. That's really exciting. And obviously, I'm here in San Francisco. I don't think there's a single topic that I can go to pretty much any computer scientist or engineer and ask them about and have such a strong elicited opinion, whether positive or negative, something other in Bitcoin or cryptocurrencies, right? So obviously Stellar exists here in San Francisco with Stripe, and there are a bunch of other, Bobby's brother Charlie works at Coinbase and invented Litecoin. There are a lot of interesting developments happening in this space, and it's a little too big at this point from an interest standpoint for it to be such a small passing fad.
So I'll take a stab. I'm also very optimistic about Bitcoin. I think Bitcoin's full potential has not nearly been realized. I agree fully about all the leading trends. But what's interesting about Bitcoin is because it is solutionary and because it is truly global, crossing countries, crossing barriers of countries, language, cultures, and all that. Because it is so revolutionary, it turns out, it has a lot of enemies, naturally speaking. It has a lot of enemies. People and companies will be uprooted if Bitcoin succeeds. And with all these enemies, whether you want to call them companies or states or governments or central banks or even other currencies, naturally there's a lot of resistance and there's a lot of power plays, happening where vested interest parties are trying to slow Bitcoin down by pulling it back, where Bitcoin is clearly trying to go upwards to the right by penetrating all walks of society and in all countries and so on. So it's this struggle. It's a struggle. So I'm optimistic. Bitcoin will succeed and win. It's a matter of time. Is 2 years enough? Is 5 years enough? Or will it take 20 years or even 200 years? That's the real question that I don't think I can answer. But I can tell you that every one of us in this Bitcoin industry, all of us working for these Bitcoin / cryptocurrency companies, we are believers and we're working our hardest to make it happen ASAP, if you will. Thanks.
One other point I wanted to make here, even just look at yesterday's news. Twitch got acquired for around $1 billion from Amazon. If you had told someone in 1994 that an e-commerce website that was selling books basically just in the early 90s had just made $1 billion purchase of a video game streaming entertainment network that had originally started as a live streaming service out of a incubator that gave them $7,000, that just like unfathomable to someone in 1994. So if you think about where Bitcoin is today versus where it will be 10, 20 years from now, that's, I think, it's a mind-numbing exercise to try to think about the situations. I think you can think of some of the macro things that can happen, but from the let me predict the future, I think that's really tough to tell.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. It sounds to me that you're both optimistic, and we are now going to move to the Q&A part of this webinar. So I'm going to ask the following question. This is coming to participants in the audience. Have either of you been approached agency in order for them to understand the Bitcoin infrastructure more clearly?
I'm happy to answer. The situation here is probably more bi-directional than you think. I think there are a lot of leading Bitcoin companies that are trying to engage with regulators proactively because there's obviously some negative association with Bitcoin sometimes related to the news and how the media likes to cover Bitcoin. I think you're seeing some of the leading companies trying to proactively engage with regulators, but I know from kind of my own experience and just thinking through some of the information that I know is regulators are pretty proactive in reaching out. And there's, I think, a genuine interest to try to understand and become well educated on this new technology because they realize that regulation is part of their legacy and they want to make sure that they're taking the most common sense approach. And I know if you're only reading our Bitcoin on Reddit, sometimes it can seem very negative, but I think there's a lot of good that's happening throughout the Bitcoin community. And I think Twitter and Reddit are both actually great vectors for being able to elicit that feedback and generate some really good thinking. But I'd say just from experience, I think the regulatory agencies have a genuine interest in trying to do the right thing.
So from my side, I have spoken to regulators in both China and Hong Kong. Speaking with them, hearing from them, trying to educate them, or they're trying to learn about Bitcoin. I think it's very shallow. I think it's this question. It's a fair question, but I don't think it's indicative of anything because in the end, it's about action that matters. So State of New York, FS, they're really going to bat. They actually sat down, learned about Bitcoin in the private time. We're meeting with companies. Normally, they go back and do the homework and actually come out with paperwork, regulation, and ask for comments. I think that's great progress. In China, regulators, we've met with them. They don't want to be named, but they certainly, there's academia that talks about Bitcoin. They learn about Bitcoin, they read about it, and so on. But what we don't see is the same level of investment. So maybe it's healthy for the U.S. to go first and set an example, and then hopefully the rest of the world will try to follow and adopt it. So I'm hopeful.
Felix, I see a question in the chat that's related to the license. I'm happy to just a high-level.
Would you like to go ahead? Yep.
Yeah. So I think what's interesting about the bit license is we talk about this wait and see approach, and no one wants to be first. And I think, as Bobby pointed out before, this is the first effort by a regulatory body to put onto paper and to put into action some real regulation around Bitcoin. That's not an immediate, this is illegal in this country, or hey, we're going to give some guidance, but say it's unregulated, we're not quite sure yet. And if the reaction from the community and the recent action by the New York DFS to extend the comment period is any indication, I think there's a legitimate chance that these guys are really trying to do the right thing here. And they're trying to balance the fact that they want to have some regulation to establish a framework for which companies who are doing Bitcoin related activities can do things in New York, but at the same time providing what they believe is the requisite amount of consumer protection or kind of anti-money laundering. I think what you'll see is that it probably fall somewhere in the middle. They wouldn't have extended the comment period for 45 days if they didn't think that the community's concerns and feedback was valid. I think that's a really encouraging sign from New York. I'm also happy to answer a question about the European Banking Authority. That's helpful.
Okay, so that's directed to you as a member of the Bitcoin Foundation Board. And let me read out this question for those who are going to be listening to this webcast recording. Can you give any insight into the breadth of potential regulators that the Foundation's reached out, such as the U.S., UK governments, and what regulators have been approached by the Foundation itself?
Yeah, I'll take that. So I've joined the board for about two and a half now. I myself have not been involved with any of the conversations with regulators around the world on behalf of the Bitcoin Foundation. You know, the Bitcoin Foundation actually has a full-time staff of several dozen people based around the world, and they take care of this. Unfortunately, I don't have the latest information in terms of which countries have a checkbox that have had conversations with Bitcoin Foundation. If this is important, I can go back to the board and make that request for us to be more transparent about, going or progress with meeting with and talking to regulators. But on the other hand, this may be sensitive. A lot of times regulators may meet with Bitcoin Foundation or meet with Bitcoin experts, but they may not want that to be known publicly that they're meeting and talking about Bitcoin. So it is a challenging question. I don't have a really good answer, I think. But the closest answer would be the obvious countries like the U.S. and the U.K. and the ones that are highly publicized.
Felix, I'm happy to answer the question about the EDA report. Or sorry, if you wanted to follow up with Bobby.
Well, since we are approaching the 1 hour mark, and this will be the last question for the panelists from the group.
Yeah, so I think the EBA report again is a first step, right? It's the fact that the European Banking Authority is even addressing virtual currencies and cryptocurrencies and putting out an official document and continuing to study it is a good thing in the long run, because that means that they're spending time that they could otherwise be spending on regulating banks or focused on other activities that they're under their purview, is that they're actually actively considering it and in trying to figure out the right framework for EU-wide policy around how countries and banks and other kind of entities can work with Bitcoin companies. And I think there are two things worth pointing out here. Is one, they did outline a lot of risks, and it was a little unfortunate not necessarily to see a whole bunch of the benefits being highlighted as much. But frankly, as a regulatory agency, they're tending to focus a little bit more on the risks than benefits, which is part of their kind of mandate. But the most positive and optimistic thing about the report is if you actually look in the executive summary, the closing paragraph leaves the door open for legitimate and good acting Bitcoin companies to be able to work in a current account relationship with regulated financial institutions, what we usually call banks, in EU countries. So what it actually does say is, hey, banks, you shouldn't actually have Bitcoin. You shouldn't store Bitcoin. You shouldn't be allowing your customers to buy and sell Bitcoin directly within your bank, but you can be actually working with Bitcoin companies. And I think the initial report is going to scare away some banks that don't actually want to read it. They just say, oh, wow, there are tons of risks here. I don't want to work with it. But upon a closer evaluation, I think you'll actually find that certain institutions might say, okay, this actually gives us some coverage to be able to go work with this Bitcoin company because we believe that they're doing everything in the right possible way. So I think that's my opinion on the EBA report. And I don't know. I think you're going to see a lot of first steps in a lot of different jurisdictions. And hopefully at some point in the next year, one or two jurisdictions, whether that's London or Canada or Singapore or here in the US or somewhere else, is going to actually develop a framework that people generally go, this is pretty good. And this as someone working in Bitcoin, I can work within this framework. And I think they're going to see a lot of benefits from that because they're going to have a lot of Bitcoin companies want to be located there.
Yeah, I agree with Dan. I think it's very
Thank you,
very
Dan.
positive.
Okay. Well, Dan, Bobby, I, on behalf of Payment Week, would like to thank you for your time and very helpful insight into this topic. I also like to thank our participants for their loyalty and participation, not only in this webinar, but also our previous regulatory series provided by Payment Week. Thank you. This will be conclusion of part 4, Bitcoin versus the world. For any questions, please feel free to contact Payment Week. You can find our contact information at paymentweek.com. Thank you. Have a nice day.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.